Hello, it's Vincent here from Vincent Games. Welcome to another MTGO video. Today we're going to be looking at Living End in Modern. Living End is a deck that focuses around getting creatures into the graveyard and then out again using the deck's namesake, Living End. This works mainly by using creatures with the cycling ability. All of the creatures here have cycling. Cycling is more or less discarding the card and then getting to draw a new card. Some of the cards do it for free, so Street Wraith enables you to pay 2 life to discard it and then draw a card, but some of them require you to pay mana. So Monstrous Carabid, Deadshot Minotaur, and Architects of Will. As you can see, next to cycling, you have to pay just 1 mana. You more or less ignore the horrendous mana costs of the creatures themselves, so Monstrous Carabid, Deadshot Minotaur, costing 5 mana, Architects of Will 4 mana. So you're never really intending to play them for their mana cost. You use the cycling to draw cards until you are able to draw any one of these 8 Cascade spells in Violent Outburst or Demonic Dread. Violent Outburst gives your creatures +1/+0. Demonic Dread, target creature can't block this turn. But the main thing you care about with these spells is the ability Cascade. Cascade allows you to reveal the top card of your library until you reveal a card that has a lesser converted mana cost than the spell that you just cast, i.e. Demonic Dread or Violent Outburst. Normally Cascade is quite random because you don't know what kind of spell you'll be getting. You could get any random spell with a less converted mana cost. However, Living End, as you may or may not have realised at this point, is the only card with a lesser converted mana cost than Demonic Dread or Violent Outburst in the deck. As such, if you cast a Violent Outburst or Demonic Dread, the only card you will be able to Cascade into and cast for free is Living End. And why is that good? Well, Living End says each player exiles all creature cards from his or her graveyard, then sacrifices all creatures he or she controls, then puts all cards he or she exiled this way onto the battlefield. Or in other words, you switch whatever you had in your graveyard with whatever you had on the battlefield. So if you spend the first few turns of the game cycling through your Deadshot Minotaurs, Architects of Will, etc., you'll have filled your graveyard up to a point where cascading into a Living End puts a stupid amount of power onto the table, whilst also having the benefit of removing most of your opponent's board. So that is pretty much what the deck is trying to do. Get loads of creatures into the graveyard quickly, and then crowbar them back out with Living End, so that you can more or less win on the spot with a horrendous amount of creatures that your opponent is unable to deal with. The remainder of the deck consists of utility cards, such as Faerie Macabre, to remove any problematic cards your opponent might have from the graveyard. And then we have Fulminator Mage to destroy non-basic lands. The fact that you can then get it back with Living End and destroy another land is pretty insane as well. Simian Spirit Guide is there to give the deck that extra bit of pace. A turn 2 Violent Outburst is quite disgusting, as at such an early point in the game, with an opponent typically only on 2 to 3 lands, they're going to struggle, and given this deck is trying to do something very degenerate very quickly, it makes sense that Simian Spirit Guide is here to help you to do that. Lastly, we have Beast Within. It's a fantastic answer to practically anything that your opponent can throw at you. And the creature that your opponent gets for free will 9 times out of 10 just be completely irrelevant, as when you cast Living End, every creature that they have gets sacrificed, so they lose it anyway. This one card gives you answers against so much hate against this deck. The things that this deck does not want to see, like Blood Moon or Leyline of the Void, Beast Within deals with, which is fantastic. And having 4 copies of this is just great. This will rarely be a dead card. The land base is all about doing things in the first 3 turns. We have 7 fast lands in Blackcleave Cliffs and Copperline Gorge. Coming into play tapped beyond turn 3 is almost completely irrelevant with this deck, given that the most expensive single spell you're going to be casting is 3 mana. And if you're not casting a Cascade spell on turn 3, you're probably just going to be cycling with multiple creatures anyway. And to support the fast mana base, you have 3 shock lands, Overgrown Tomb, Stomping Ground, and Blood Crypt, alongside 5 fetch lands, So 4 red-black fetch lands and 1 green-black fetch land. As with a lot of decks in Modern, this combination of shock lands and fetch lands is very efficient. And it is rounded out with 4 basic lands, 2 swamps, 1 forest and 1 mountain. One thing I have felt through playing this deck is that not only is the mana base really lean, but it's also really efficient. Unless I've been very lucky, I found that very rarely does this deck have mana problems, which is a great appeal. As for the sideboard, you have 3 Leyline of the Void for any kind of opposing graveyard interaction, 3 Shriekmaw, which is great. It has Evoke, so you're very rarely casting it for 5 mana. Evoke basically means you can cast it for 2 mana instead of 5. However, when it enters the battlefield, you have to sacrifice it. And Shriekmaw, when it enters the battlefield, allows you to destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature, which is great. So against any kind of aggressive creature-based deck, Shriekmaw is a really nice inclusion to have. We also have Ingot Chewer as another evoke creature, but one specifically targeted towards artifacts. So any problematic artifacts we think might be being brought in against us, we can bring in Ingot Chewer to help us deal with those. We also have Brindle Boar for burn, specifically. The ability to play him on 3 mana, whilst not in keeping with how we would normally be playing our creatures, is really useful, as it's not something your opponent really wants to shoot burn at, and if they do, then great. If we can cast it on turn 3, it's really nice because it can block and then be sacrificed to gain life, hopefully allowing the deck the time it needs to do its thing. I'm not 100% convinced on Brindle Boar, but I do feel that burn can be a bad matchup. You need to be so quick against them. Given the matchup between burn is completely non-interactive, almost to the point of ignoring everything that your opponent does and then ignoring everything that you do, it's nice to have something to interact with them in some way to give us time. And it also synergizes with what we're doing. Getting it out on turn 3 to block something like Goblin Guide and then sacrifice it, it's giving us 6 life, which could easily be the difference between getting burnt out or not getting burnt out. So we'll see how it goes. Finally, we have Ricochet Trap, which is a concession to the fact that counter magic can tear this deck apart. So if an opponent casts a blue spell this turn, you may pay 1 red rather than Ricochet Trap's mana cost. Change the target of target spell with a single target. So you effectively stop them from countering your key spell. A key interaction to note with counter magic versus Cascade spells is that if they try to counter your Violent Outburst, it does not stop you from cascading. So if they're playing correctly, they will allow a Violent Outburst to resolve and counter the Living End instead. Countering the Violent Outburst would do nothing. So yeah, Ricochet Trap, there to stop us being completely dead to counter magic of any kind. So that's Living End. Cycle through your deck, get creatures in the graveyard, get them back with Living End, and beat your opponent to death. I like this deck because it does something degenerate and unfair. A lot of people might dislike that about Modern in general, let alone a deck like this, but that's Modern, and the format is full of incredibly powerful things. And if people aren't prepared for a deck like this, then they will get crushed by this sort of deck. But not only that, this deck is quite fun. And one of the appeals for me is it is quite consistent. The ability to cycle through your deck so quickly means that it's quite easy to draw into one of your key Cascade pieces. The only bad thing with this deck is there's no real way of getting around just drawing a Living End naturally, and there is no way of shuffling this back into your library to then cascade into it at a later point. So you can have games where you draw all 3 copies of Living End and you have to wait till turn 4 to suspend it and then wait 3 turns for that to go off, which is far from ideal. And another reason why Simian Spirit Guide is a little bit useful, because if you are in a situation where you've drawn a Living End, and Simian Spirit Guide isn't necessarily going to be giving you the boost in tempo that you might normally use him for, then using him to help suspend Living End for 4 mana is not completely irrelevant. But if you do ultimately draw Living End, it can be pretty rough, as waiting till turn 4 to suspend it, and then having to wait to remove time counters is just awful. But it's not often that a deck doesn't have some sort of downside. It would be nice to have a way to shuffle it back in, but I can't think of a way to include that into the deck without severely affecting its game plan, which is otherwise pretty well streamlined. But there we are. So we're going to try this deck out in a modern league and see how we get on.